Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started now. Sorry for the delay. Glad for the folks who were able to join us. Because we have at least one person. Is it Karaya who's new? I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Lisa Ridge, the president of New Jersey Humanist Network. Thank everybody for joining us today from wherever you are for this program. I want to tell you a little bit about New Jersey Humanist Network. NJHN is a secular humanist community founded in 1994. The non-theistic philosophy or life stance of secular humanism embraces human reason, ethics, social justice, and philosophical naturalism, affirming that we have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to our own lives. We're committed to the application of reason and science to our understanding of the universe and our solutions to problems through compassion, our common experience, and civic engagement. We support progressive ideals and encourage lifelong learning and respect for the natural world and our human diversity. We host a variety of programs and activities that support our educational, political, and social goals. We're based in Somerset County, and we have members throughout the state. Our goal is to connect New Jerseyans with a humanist group in their area or help build one. We hold monthly programs like today's. Pre-pandemic, those were held at the Franklin Township Public Library in Somerset, but we've been holding them virtually on Zoom since the pandemic started. We hope to return to in-person meetings at the library once they reopen their community room to outside groups. Hopefully that'll be the first of the year in 2023. We have restarted our monthly dinner at the Omega Diner in North Brunswick on the third Tuesdays, and we still have a virtual diner on the second Tuesdays. We have a book club that meets on the fourth Thursdays, and an Exploring Humanism course that meets on the first Sundays. So all of those events are, with the dates and the times, are all on our website. You can see where you can find us on social media, and you can find information about all of our activities on our website at njhn.org. If this is your first meeting with us, thanks for checking us out today. If you're here every or almost every month, thanks for being part of our community. We are a 501c3 nonprofit educational membership organization. Our members' annual dues help fund all of our activities and programs. We hope you will join us as we support and promote our humanist values in New Jersey. So, I want to give our speaker, well, I'll do this first. Okay. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who is Chrissy Stroop. Chrissy is the co-editor with Lauren O'Neill of Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, which is an anthology of personal essays by former conservative Christians. Chrissy was raised in the Christian right and subjected to a Christian nationalist education in evangelical schools. Now a vocal critic of the Christian right, Chrissy is a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches and a columnist for Open Democracy. She holds a PhD in modern Russian history from Stanford University, and her work has also appeared in Foreign Policy, the Boston Globe, Playboy, Dame Magazine, Alternate, The Conversationalist, and other outlets, including peer-reviewed academic journals. An advocate for pluralist coexistence as an essential component of healthy democratic society, Chrissy is proud of her record of working with both religious and secular organizations in pursuit of the common good. Chrissy came out as a transgender woman in 2019 and currently resides in Portland, Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Chrissy Stroop to our program today.
Thank you, Lisa, for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello, everybody from the West Coast. So should I just launch right into my presentation, or?
You do whatever you would like.
All right. Well, I did put together a little slide presentation for today's talk. I'm going to start sort of thinking about some broad characteristics that help to define Christian nationalism. And then I'll talk about my own experience growing up and what we've now come to call Christian nationalism. I put together sort of a little photo essay to emphasize certain points that I think often aren't really well known or talked about in the press. And then I'll come back to some more sort of theoretical aspects of the issue and talk about how Christian nationalism is a kind of story, a kind of narrative that gives a certain purpose to people, and how I think we can counter that narrative with other sorts of stories, like those that Lauren and I included in our essay anthology of Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. I've been working over the last few years to try and highlight people who have left high control and high demand religious groups like evangelical Christianity. Most evangelical churches are high control types of environments. And even though there's a lot of different denominations there, there's also a lot of direct connections that tie them together, including both political institutions and what they call parachurch institutions, which simply means that these institutions transcend denominations. And then there are, of course, big denominational institutions that have influence outside their own denominations as well. So evangelicalism is not a very centralized thing, but it has given a lot of people very similar experiences. And I've been doing interviews with a lot of other people like me, as well as just getting to know people online over the last few years. And I'm working toward a book just specifically about evangelical history from the point of view of people who have left it behind. So this kind of stuff is fresh in my mind. And it did just drive home to me how, despite, whether we were Baptist or Wesleyan or independent Christian church or any number of other things, we had a lot of things in common and a lot of common criticisms and a lot of insights into, why evangelicals would vote for someone like Donald Trump, which of course was the question that launched 1,000 think pieces starting in 2016, most of them not very interesting in my view. And that's one of the reasons that I think, pundits and journalists in the American public should start listening to people who grew up in this movement and left it behind. So anyway, all that just sort of by way of introduction. And now I'm going to do the share screen thing and start my slide presentation for today's talk. Let's see here. Need to go into slideshow mode. Okay, so I'm going to try to unpack all of these concepts a little bit with reference to kind of what this is like on the ground and how, where Christian nationalism came from. It's not a new thing. It's good that everyone is paying attention to it now, although I think it's also very belated. And I think just thinking of it in terms of Christian nationalism might be a little bit limiting. So I want to think about broader ways to make connections here and understand this phenomenon of, authoritarian Christianity in the United States, what it means, how it's a threat to democracy and human rights, and so forth. So let's launch into that with the question, what is Christian nationalism? Now, if you look at the visuals here, the first one there on the left side of your screen is a picture I just recently took for this presentation from my 6th grade yearbook from Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis, Indiana. Note the sort of heraldic imagery. The eagle, by the way, is the mascot of Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis. And then, I was looking around at different Christian schools online, and Heritage Christian School is such a common name. I found another one with very similar heraldic imagery. This one is in Virginia, And so I just put them side by side. And I think it's interesting to think about what's going on here. This kind of imagery invokes concepts of Western civilization that are often associated with conservative groups. They often carry some racial baggage to them. And it's not to say that talking about civilization has to be a racist thing, but it often is. Both these schools are named Heritage, and if you just Google Heritage Christian School or Academy, you'll get a ridiculous number of results from across America. So what's the deal with that word heritage? And these schools tended to be founded in the 1960s and 1970s. Heritage, of course, is a word that there's nothing wrong with it just on the surface of it, but it is kind of a code word or a buzzword for people who tend to be either pro-Confederate or simply pro some notion of conservative Christian America, which is coded white, even if they don't say the white part out loud. So this is the kind of stuff that you're just steeped in if you grow up in these communities, if you're socialized in these kinds of schools, and you don't necessarily even think about it, but these are the symbols that start to define, the story that you find yourself in. So all that being said, let's look at these sort of 3 points here. Christian nationalism is authoritarian. It is specifically Christian dominionist, and it's perpetuated by indoctrinating children. And also through the use of a number of institutions. These include lobbying organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and there's that word heritage again, which was founded in 1973, but also things like, Christian bookstores, Christian publishers. There's this whole parallel institutional and information universe that you live in, and creating that kind of parallel society, particularly when you couple that with intense social discipline and indoctrination, is a good way to kind of make sure that most people will stay in your group or won't necessarily want to go exploring for outside information. Now, it's a lot harder to do that than it used to be. And my anecdotal experience, and well, certainly also the data here, show that a lot of people these days are leaving. I created a Facebook group for people who graduated from Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis. And, most of the people in that group are much younger than me. It seems like a lot of kids who grew up as digital natives they're seeing through it much earlier than a lot of people from my generation did. I was born in 1980 and are leaving it behind, but they still, in many cases, have a lot of trauma from the process of being indoctrinated, being, punished if they won't accept the alternative facts of the community that they're grown up in. Anyway, let's unpack these terms a little bit, particularly this term dominionist. Now, dominionism is a term that some Christians use to define themselves. It's used with respect to Christian Reconstructionists, which themselves may be a very sort of marginal, hardline Calvinist group that believes in implementing what they call the Old Testament law for American society, stoning of rebellious children and gay people and all of that. There are other dominionists who come more out of the charismatic Christian tradition. That is, they believe in signs and wonders, speaking in tongues, being slain in the spirit, all that sort of thing. Their dominionism is usually defined as Seven Mountains dominionism. That is, they think Christians should try to take control of these seven sort of social groups or aspects of society that include family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. Now, when you're growing up in this kind of environment, you're attending these Christian schools, or you're just going to churches that preach and believe this sort of thing, you don't necessarily know these terms, Christian Reconstructionism, Seven Mountains, Dominionism, but you are taught a lot of concepts that come directly out of them. And in fact, Christian Reconstruction, despite not having a lot of people who call themselves Christian Reconstructionists, the ideologues behind it, particularly R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North, developed a lot of the curricula that are used in Christian schools and used for Christian homeschooling today. And so they have a lot of influence on the indoctrination of children. And they talk a lot about this concept of the Christian worldview and how they think our society should be brought into conformity with this Christian worldview, that is, should be basically forced to be obedient to God. There's a lot of emphasis on obedience in any sort of authoritarian community. And then there are a few other aspects that I have highlighted for how I think about authoritarianism, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, let me just give you a little context and background here. These kinds of Christian schools, we're talking for the most part about, non-Catholic, evangelical or fundamentalist Christian schools. They're part of this big wave of institution building that the Christian right did in reaction to the 1960s, to the civil rights movement and the hippies and so forth. Back during the fight for civil rights and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, certain leaders in the Christian right, who later became very important for this wave of 1970s and 1980s institution building, tended to denounce Martin Luther King as a communist. Jerry Falwell Sr. certainly did that. And he and Paul Weyrich, who's a Catholic who founded the Moral Majority, worked together to rally people around the anti-abortion cause starting in the late 1970s. So that was very important to how the Moral Majority was founded. And it's right then in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan that this particular sort of Christian right, where the real sort of powerhouse of it is mostly white, conservative, evangelical Protestants, it crystallizes in that moment of 1980. This is when they become a powerful political force. And there's a lot of parallels if you look back to the 80s to the present. There was this satanic panic, this moral panic that was happening, driving fear, driving people to become more conservative. Today, we see the same sort of thing with the QAnon conspiracy theories. There's a lot of direct echoes of this satanic panic there. And Ronald Reagan, of course, used the slogan, "Let's make America great again," for his 1980 campaign. But anyway, I want to focus on how during this period of institution building, right-wing evangelicals, they also started founding publishers like Abeka Book, also Bob Jones University Press, and Accelerated Christian Education. They're all products of this period. Focus on the family, became a media empire, and then became an important lobbying organization, which eventually branched off into the Family Research Council. Moral Majority isn't really a powerful thing today, but it had a major impact at the time and gave rise to, a later model of, to other institutions that continued to lobby politicians effectively. And I want to highlight that in the 1980s, HSLDA, that's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which I always say is the sort of most important Christian right lobby you've never heard of, started using the legal system and the courts to pursue almost total deregulation of homeschooling so that right-wing Christians could use it to indoctrinate their children. And they were very successful across the 80s, to the point that we have very little effective regulation of homeschooling today. Note too that the kind of Christian schools that I'm talking about, which are where, they're sort of the incubators for the next generation of Christian nationalists, many of them started as segregation academies. Not all of them, but certainly in the South in the 1960s, that's where that started. You call the school a Christian school, then you have religious freedom, and religious freedom in that period means you can be whites only. It stops meaning that by the early 1980s. There's a famous Supreme Court case involving Bob Jones University and the ban that it had, first on African-American students being admitted at all, and then on interracial dating. And it lost its tax-exempt status. So, they no longer could say that part out loud, but it's a big part of the history and the baggage that this history carries. Anyway, and now let's talk a little bit about authoritarianism. Three things that I find useful to think about, and I put them together, in all words that start with the same letter. So if you like alliteration, if that helps you as a mnemonic device, maybe you'll like this. And if not, sorry. But anyway, I'm highlighting disinformation, division, and demonization. These are all aspects of growing up where your family and your church and your school or your educational environment, pretty much most of your social environments that you're in, reinforce these kinds of rules. So first of all, you've got your own information ecosystem parallel to the mainstream information ecosystem. These days, you've probably heard of a lot of people from the alt-right, will constantly, of course, throwing around the term fake news, calling CNN fake news. We had the term alternative facts introduced in, I think, 2016 or 2017 by Kellyanne Conway. Some people have deliberately revived the Nazi term Lügenpresse, that is the lying press. Anyway, I always like to say that in conservative Christian communities, we've been doing alternative facts since before it was cool. And what does this have to do with? Well, it has to do with a lot of things. First of all, of course, a sort of literalist interpretation of the Bible, including young earth creationism. So anti-science, science often is represented as conspiratorial, and scientists, they're atheists because they don't want to obey God. Often comes with climate change denial as well. And also, of course, literal death and resurrection of Jesus, all the miracles, and usually with a particularly sort of gruesome interpretation of the crucifixion of Christ, which is called penal substitutionary atonement, meaning that Christ took the punishment for you. And so, because we all are terrible, terrible people, and we all deserve to go to hell and be tortured forever, it's pretty horrible. But if you get people thinking that, they don't deserve anything, they're awful in and of themselves, and only this one person, or in this case, this one God, can save you, then the people who speak for God have a lot of power. And I want to point out there's a parallel too that you can see with someone like Donald Trump, a kind of classic abuser, manipulator, con artist, comes in and says, oh, wow, you've got all these problems, but it's okay. You have terrible problems, everything's a mess, but only I can fix it. Only I can fix it, right? That's kind of part and parcel of an authoritarian information ecosystem. Anyway, when you have an authoritarian system, a key part of it is also dividing people. You want to make the in-group feel superior to the out-group. And when we talk about something like nationalism, this means defining certain people as, the real Americans or the real nation, and other people as outside that, be that African Americans, immigrants, transgender people, and so forth. And then you work to maintain control over the population that adheres to this ideology by demonizing your enemies. So the Christian right thinks of current events in history in terms of literal spiritual warfare, imagining that demons are constantly tempting us, angels and demons, meaning this very literally, are constantly fighting with each other in order to try to pursue either God's ends, God's will, or Satan's will. He wants to undermine God's plan, supposedly. And so one upshot of thinking in such stark black and white terms is that there can be no compromise with the other side. We're not talking about opponents, we're talking about enemies. And evangelicals are often very casual when they talk about this sort of thing. And they'll say it with a sneer on their face. They will call Democrats demoncrats. When they say the word liberal, it's said with a sneer, and it means the antonym of Christian from their point of view. Anyway, and if you want to talk about the kinds of schools that perpetuate this way of thinking and try to basically enforce it in children by a lot of fear mongering about hell, about the outside world where people kill babies and they don't want us to be able to pray. There are about 2,400 non-Catholic Christian schools in the United States that receive public funding via state voucher and tax credit programs, and that use the big three right-wing Christian school curricula, being Abeka, Bob Jones, and accelerated Christian education. There was some really good in-depth research done a few years ago for Huffington Post. showing that. And I don't know how many more there are that don't take voucher funding. But this is not a small thing. This is actually a pretty large thing. Even if white evangelicals only make up about 16% of the American population right now, they punch politically above their weight, and they use these institutions to basically try to control kids and force them to grow up and be exactly like their parents, pursue the same retrograde reactionary goals. Anyway, let's get back to this question of what is Christian nationalism, and this is where I want to launch on a little bit of a photo essay. Here I have some logos from other Christian schools, and I think it's quite interesting how many of them use crusader imagery in addition to the heraldic imagery that we saw earlier. This kind of imagery is not just invoking Western civilization, but it's invoking a militant stance toward anyone who disagrees with a conservative Christian approach to Western civilization, to what our society should be. And it's a funny thing, when I started trying to take a step back and contextualize my own experience that I had growing up, I started Googling Christian schools, seeing what the mascots were for different Christian schools. And I found out that, they're not really very creative people. There are only a few mascots for the vast majority of Christian schools in the country. The ones that come up over and over again are crusaders or knights or some variation on that. Here on the left, you see a screenshot from the website of the Christian Academy of Louisville, Kentucky. Their mascot is the Saints, but the mascot is represented wearing a knight's helmet. Eagles is very common. Patriots is a pretty common mascot, and then Lions is another one. And that's really it. Those are the only mascots they have. In fact, Christians joke about this themselves. That is, conservative evangelicals joke about this. I found this Baptist meme, basically all Christian school mascots in one post, and it's got, an eagle, a crusader, and a patriot. Think about what that kind of imagery is doing. I went to a school where we had the eagle for the mascot, and that clearly linked our school to American patriotism and to what today we would call Christian nationalism. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how that worked in a minute. But it wasn't necessarily as inherently militant as a crusader, which, not coincidentally, is also the kind of image that's being used a lot by the alt-right today, by the very online reactionaries of 4chan and those kinds of websites. They're using a lot of this crusader imagery. And then patriots, again, just very clearly links this notion of Christianity and a particular white Christian spin on it, often with the idea that, yes, America was founded as a Christian country, but even if you don't have that, with the idea that Christians should take dominion over America and make it a Christian country, at least in terms of the laws that it has, it's invoked by these images. And yeah, sometimes conservative Christians have a little bit of self-awareness. And so, I found this from Baptist memes. Anyway, let's talk about some other images now. Now, this is a picture of a little sanctuary in a church. I got this from a website that was talking about whether Christians should venerate the flag in their churches and so forth. It was from a Christian perspective that basically rejected that idea. So of course, those Christians are out there too. But this is a pretty, this image would probably be pretty familiar to most people who grew up in right-wing evangelical churches. A lot of those churches in their sanctuaries fly both the American flag and the Christian flag. I want to bring up the Christian flag too, because it's typically flown along with the American flag in Christian schools as well. And in a lot of Christian elementary schools, children say not just one, not just two, but actually 3 pledges every day. So you want to talk about Christian nationalism, combining these things. When I was in elementary school, and this is still done in a lot of Christian schools today, we started the morning with a pledge to the American flag, followed by a pledge to the Christian flag, followed by a pledge to the Bible. To tell you a little bit about the history of the Christian flag, I'll just say that it was created in the early 20th century in a more sort of ecumenical Christian context. It wasn't meant to be militant. It was meant to be sort of a symbol of peace among different Christians. But it has very much become something else. It's seen commonly with people who also fly Confederate flags, battle flags. It showed up at the January 6th insurrection. And the pledge, there are different versions of the pledge that are out there, but the pledge that said the kind of evangelical schools that try to produce Christian nationalist children is very anti-pluralist. You know, there's the more liberal version that ends with something about brotherhood, but you know, the version that I grew up pledging ends with one Savior, crucified, risen, and coming again with life and liberty for all who believe. Not for all who believe. And that's just a image lifted from C-SPAN. It's not very good, but you can probably see, I mean, it's grainy, but you can probably see this is the January 6th insurrection. There's a Trump flag and a Christian flag being flown right next to each other. And of course, we also recall that a Christian flag was carried into the well of the Senate when the insurrectionists breached the Capitol. So these are expressions of Christian nationalism. These are the kind of symbols that motivate people who represent what I would consider the most serious threat to democracy and human rights in the United States today. And these are the kinds of things that they write about in their alternative media ecosystem. So these are screenshots I took from two articles from the Christian Post. The first one there is from 2017, and it was taken after the Freedom from Religion Foundation wrote a letter to a Texas school challenging it for flying the Christian flag on public property. It's a public school. And so, of course, the Freedom from Religion Foundation was doing the right thing there. And so some of the students decided to fly Christian flags from their pickup trucks outside the school in protest, apparently. Now, on the right, you see a screenshot from a much more recent article. It came out just a couple of days ago. Is it unfaithful for Christians to vote for Democrats? And the short answer from that article would be yes. But actually, I'd like to read you just a little bit from it, just to emphasize, you know, how these sorts of people think. So the person who's writing this article, Samuel Say, is kind of rebuking some evangelicals for backing away from being called Christian nationalists or from saying that Christians should only vote for Republicans. And so he writes, Christ isn't the reason why some evangelicals refuse to encourage Christians to rescue preborn babies from slaughter. Yeah, that's not what actually happens in abortion. But anyway, he goes on, Christ hasn't changed. And what it really means to be Christ-centered hasn't changed. But the culture has changed, so some of these evangelicals have also changed. Therefore, it's now offensive and controversial for evangelicals to encourage Christians to vote in a biblical manner, meaning some evangelicals choose to protect themselves from being called offensive instead of protecting babies from murder. Nevertheless, is it unfaithful for Christians to vote for Democrats? Is it a sin if a Christian supports pro-abortion politicians? Yes. If you support an unjust politician, you're guilty of injustice and unfaithfulness to God, end quote. So yeah, this website, by the way, the Christian Post, you may never have heard of it, but its editor-in-chief is a man named Richard Land. He is a very influential bigwig in the Southern Baptist Convention. So in that alternative media ecosystem, it does have some power. And this is the kind of messaging that I got growing up all the time in church, in school, that, you know, of course, Christians have to vote for Republicans because liberals are these evil people who kill babies and we have to stop them. And also they want to stop us from praying in school and we have to put prayer back in school. We have to be obedient to God. So yeah, you get that message just drilled into your head over and over again, the demonization of the other. It's all been part of a decades-long process through which the Christian right and Christian nationalists have essentially merged with the Republican Party. Starting back then in 1980, when they became a powerful political force, eventually they have come to basically define the Republican Party, to the point at which today, you know, Andrew Torba, the founder of GAB, who is very openly anti-Semitic, makes these very belligerent comments that, you know, Republicans cannot, Republican leaders can't distance themselves from Christian nationalists. They need to embrace them because Republicans are Christian nationalists. That's the Republican base, he says. You can't alienate us, you need us. And, you know, he's more openly extreme than some, but he's not wrong. Anyway, with all that sort of to set the stage, let's pull back and now try to define Christian nationalism a little bit more formally. One of the most recent books to come out about the topic of Christian nationalism is called The Flag and the Cross. It's by Philip S. Gorski and Samuel L. Perry. And they take Arlie Russell Hochschild's term deep story and use it to unpack what Christian nationalism means. It is a deep story about America's past and a vision for its future, centered on the myth of the United States as a Christian nation. And I wanted to kind of throw all of those images and experiences at you before bringing up this definition, so you could see how a deep story like that is formed and how it is perpetuated, and how people rally around symbols to represent and understand these stories in which they represent themselves, the narratives that give their lives meaning. Christian nationalism as a narrative is shaped by majoritarian grievance. I talked earlier about how all this Christian right institution building happened after civil rights gains, which is not a coincidence at all. Christian nationalism understood this way is largely an attempt to defend Christian privilege. And it's funny because in all the discussion about Christian nationalism, we don't tend to talk about Christian privilege very much. And I think we need to bring that part of the story to the fore if we want to understand what's happening. But in any case, Christian nationalism, as defined by the sociologists who recently brought the term into the public discourse, Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead, you know, it basically means refers to a whole complex of beliefs about America being a Christian nation, the founders all being good Christians, understood as basically the same kind of Christians as conservative evangelicals today, which is, of course, wildly inaccurate. But what I want to emphasize is that I don't think we should get hung up too much on whether or not evangelicals who vote for people like Donald Trump all believe that. They don't necessarily. Some understand that, you know, there were deists and agnostics among the founders, different kinds of Christians, but they all pretty much believe that America should be under Christian rule if it wants to flourish. And many predict that there will be divine punishment if the nation is not compelled to be, quote, obedient to God by doing things like banning abortion, having God in schools, you know, official prayer in schools, and keeping LGBTQ folks from having rights. So all of those things that are different to them and therefore threatening are said to be affronts to God. That's a sort of moral panic, which is often an effective tool for making a power grab. That's the kind of story that shapes Christian nationalism. Real Americans are these good conservative Christians in the middle of the country. They've got wholesome family values, and it's all of those coastal elites like you and I guess now me, hi from the West Coast again, you know, who are ruining America, and they need to be put in their place, basically, is the thinking. And now I want to bring up Christian privilege a little bit and how it gives cover to folks like these. So, of course, Christianity is the hegemonic religion in the United States. And pretty soon after the founders' generation, when, you know, a lot of those late 18th century dudes were very influenced by the Enlightenment and thought that fanatical religion, which they would have referred to as enthusiasm, was very, very bad for something like a republic, which they were trying to create. But, it's not too long into the 19th century that we start to see people like Madison and Jefferson worrying that people are starting to understand America as a Christian country. So this idea starts to creep in pretty early on. And Christianity becomes culturally hegemonic. And so given that that is the case, I think if we're willing to speak about white privilege, male privilege, and so forth, we should be willing to speak about Christian privilege as well. And I'll just say in passing that, yes, not all Christian groups benefit to the same extent. White Protestants are definitely at the top of the hierarchy, but Christian privilege is very much a reality. And I think for many humanists and atheists, this is not news to us, but it's still something that it's really hard to talk about in the American mainstream. And in fact, in mainstream discussions of Christian nationalism, part of the reason that people are reluctant to get to the root of it is that they get hung up on trying to say, well, this is not real Christianity, or this is not a real interpretation of the teachings of Jesus. But that very defensiveness and that equating of Christianity with an unequivocal good is an example of Christian privilege. And in fact, I've argued in much of my writing, it ends up then giving cover to extremist Christians who still benefit from the basic, equation that we're programmed with to have in our minds of Christian equals good. And in fact, a lot of people end up getting pulled into Christian homeschooling co-ops where they get radicalized or putting their kids into Christian schools because they are trying to get their kids the best education possible. And some Christian schools, despite being very ideologically motivated, really do a good job of educating people in some ways. Others do not. Some are very fly-by-night. But the kind of school that I went to, it had AP classes. The education in math was good. We learned how to write, how to identify logical fallacies and formulate our thoughts in the form of an argument. So, some of the education was good, but it was very ideological. Anyway, with this concept of privilege, I don't know how many of you might or might not have read this old 1980s essay by Peggy McIntosh called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege. But I think I want to just read a little bit of that because we can bring in some parallels to with Christian privilege that I think will help to unpack the concept. So in that essay, she lists off a lot of things that come from white privilege. Here are a couple. I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. So it's a whole list of a bunch of these sorts of things that we don't necessarily think about unless we take a step back to try to look at society as a system. And Christian privilege operates in a similar way. So inspired by McIntosh, thinking about this presentation, getting ready for it, I came up with just a few quickly off the top of my head, and I imagine we could come up with more. But Christian privilege is expressed in at least, the following ways. Christians always get their holidays recognized. The Jewish high holy days are coming up. It can be harder for Jews to get time off for those holidays, but everybody gets time off for Christmas. If you're Christian in this country, you have chaplains readily available. Churches are just an accepted sort of part of the landscape. Nobody bats an eye. As a rule, they are not vandalized or targeted with violence. Whereas when a mosque goes up in a community, it can be a target for violence, for protests, for vandalism. Synagogues, we've seen a lot of violence and vandalism happening in recent years. There's one exception to this rule about churches, though, of course, and that is that African-American churches are also sometimes targeted for violence. And so, as I said, Christian privilege is not evenly distributed, but it very much does exist. And in many ways, it is bound up with white privilege in the United States. So if you are a conservative white person, Christianity is almost assumed. And it's difficult to counter these kinds of stories, including the more liberal story that, Christianity is basically a good thing, secularization is a bad thing, and oh, those other Christians, the ones who want to ban abortion, they're not the real Christians. That's one powerful story. So is the Christian nationalist story that Christianity, understood as it is by white conservative Christians, should define our country and have the power of coercive law to shape our possibilities and our realities. In this kind of environment, stories of people who have left this kind of Christianity, I think, can function as powerful counter stories if they can get a hearing. And this term counter story, I picked it up from this book, The Neutrality Trap, Disrupting and Connecting for Social Change, which by the way, I recommend. And so that's why over the last few years, I've been trying to do what I can to highlight and uplift these kinds of stories like mine of leaving that kind of environment behind and rejecting that ideology. We've done that through hashtags, like hashtag exvangelical, coined by my friend Blake Chastain. Hashtag expose Christian schools in 2019 got over 200,000 tweets, generated a lot of heat. And yet it was denounced by Fox News, but it wasn't picked up by, other mainstream cable news at all, which is unfortunate. These stories are challenging something powerful, and it's hard to break through. I think it's a similar aspect to how politicians always use God talk. Christianity is always sort of at the forefront of presidential debates and elections. Atheists are often not accommodated. Religious minorities, second-class citizens relative to Christians. Those are all de facto true things, and things that Christian nationalists are trying to keep true, and also trying to make it so that only their kind of Christian, the very conservative, anti-choice, anti-queer kind, is the only kind that counts. And they're using their institutions to push a concept of religious freedom that is actually anti-pluralist and anti-democratic and takes everyone else's religious freedom away so that they can impose their will on the country. I should also say that hashtag exvangelical, no, Empty the Pews was also a hashtag before it was a book title that did pretty well in 2017 on Twitter. Twitter is where I experimented with doing this via hashtags. Now I'm trying to do it primarily through writing, through the book I'm currently working on, previously through Empty the Pews. But on the kinds of social media that are used more by younger people, I'm 42, Instagram and TikTok, the exvangelical hashtag is doing very well. I saw just the other day that exvangelical was about to reach 1 billion mentions, or maybe it was 1 billion views. I think 1 billion views on TikTok. And it probably has surpassed it by now. So on social media, the counter stories are gaining ground. But I think if we want to be able to use them for effective advocacy, for equality, for non-believers, for religious minorities, we need to find more effective ways to get them into the mainstream public. And I'd like to brainstorm with you about how to possibly do that. It's an interesting thing because we have started to see evangelicals pick up on this term exvangelical that many of us have been using online since 2016 or so. They've written some things very much misrepresenting exvangelical experience and demonizing it. So they're trying to control the narrative. I think a lot of my advocacy and activism is shaped by this idea that I don't want to be anyone's morality tale. I want to take my story back, and I want to empower others to take our stories back, get a hearing, and in the process, hopefully change American society for better. So I will basically stop here and open it up for discussion. So thank you. And yeah, I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Chrissy. That's a lot of information.
Yeah, maybe a little too much, and I'm sorry.
Some of us, myself, I knew somewhat a lot of it from other books that I've read, and Thea Butler's book on white evangelical racism. She in that.
Yeah, that's a good book. So is Kristen Kobes-Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne, about the masculinity angle to all of this, the hyper masculine politics that we always see with fascism, and how the masculine has been constructed in evangelical subculture. Really great study.
And I noticed in the chat that Mariah, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly, talked about Andrew Seidel's new book, American Crusade, which I too just gotten in the mail this week. So
I've got an advanced copy over there as well. Yeah.
If that will be on
in it.
I saw that. Yeah, right toward the beginning, and I'm so flattered that he got on the "stop calling them fake Christians" bandwagon and cited me. Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
We did that all out. I was like, oh, this is so good.
Possible that this will wind up on our book club list for in 2023. So, who has questions?
Comments, complaints, criticisms, anything.
Jan Jasper in the chat is saying, Chrissy, it's not too much information at all. This group wants and needs to know this stuff, however scary it is. So.
Thanks. I guess in the moment of giving this presentation, I thought it was all very well organized in my head before, but now I'm kind of thinking it could have been a little bit more coherently organized. So I'm always my own worst critic, but hopefully that information kind of all fit together, right? This piece of, well, where does Christian nationalism come from? How is it constructed in the evangelical social environment? And then, what is it politically? That was how I tried to organize it, kind of two parts, and I don't know how well that came through.
If I didn't already, I want to thank you for being with us today and giving the talk. So let's
happy to.
What is it that you want us to help brainstorm about? You're saying you want to.
Yeah. So this idea of a counter story. And of course, not the exvangelical counter stories aren't the only kind of counter story to the sort of mainstream narrative that Christianity is basically good and basically should define America. Secularization is a scary thing. I know atheists and humanist groups have been putting out counter stories for a very long time, but how could we make them more effective? What media could we use? How could we have more influence on the mainstream media? What should secular advocacy look like to in order to reach more people? I have some thoughts on this. I mean, personally, I think that the sort of street epistemology model, or trying to get in your face and like sort of convert people to atheism, is not a helpful approach for the most part. But what is going to work, I don't know. There's like this wall you keep crashing into when you want to get people to listen to the experiences and the stories of people who are harmed by Christian privilege and Christian hegemony. So my one thought there is we absolutely have to do this in coalition with religious minorities, including liberal Christians who are also on the outs with, conservative Christians, but sometimes that's tricky too, because they still are steeped in a lot of Christian privilege that they haven't unpacked. So I think one thing is we have to talk about Christian privilege, which nobody is doing. And we have to be willing to, advocate for equality and pluralism with religious minorities. It can't just be about atheists are the only people who are right, we're smarter than everyone else, because that story doesn't sell, right? We have to find ways to work together, but to break through that wall that our gatekeepers uphold in the media, that's a tricky thing. So anyway, yeah, I see people have their hands up, so I'll stop talking.
Rhonda, go ahead.
Chrissy, thank you so much. Great presentation. I could listen for longer. Well, maybe not on Zoom, but you know what I'm saying. So yeah, I totally agree that we need to change that narrative. The thing is, what I'd like to see is I'd like to see us norm secularism. Right now, Christianity is the norming, right? So our society is normed to Christianity, and that's, like you say, all of the holidays, days off that people get from work are aligned with Christianity. But I guess I would like us to move toward secularism being our national and cultural norm. And I'm not so, I don't know, I'm conflicted because for me, there was so much harm from the proselytizing side of things that I don't want to perpetuate that sort of thing, but we do have to get our stories out there.
Yeah, I think normalization absolutely should be the goal, with the caveat that I don't want to claim, dominance, just that it should be just as normal to, dislike Jesus as it should be to think Jesus is the greatest thing since sliced bread, which, as we all know, he also shows up on sometimes when you make a grilled cheese sandwich. But
Jan?
Thank you, Lisa. Chrissy, I was wondering, how do we know that street epistemology doesn't work? Has anyone actually done a study, or is this just a few anecdotal evidence, which I don't think counts for much?
Fair. There certainly have been some studies in cognitive science over the last few years that, most people's minds are not changed by facts and reason. So that's the intellectual basis for me arguing that, we have to connect with people on an emotive level. And I think the power of stories can be valuable for that. And I also think it can be a good idea simply to put the debating aspect of things sort of aside as an emphasis in the atheist community. Now, for people who just enjoy debating, some of us, of course, in our own experience, we have the experience of being convinced by facts and arguments. We think that other people are like that too. But we also might sometimes be fooling ourselves through our own, confirmation bias, that there might be some other reasons that we've gravitated to the things that we have. But I do think certainly, the people who are skilled in critical thinking and value that and grow up in communities that value that are more likely to be convinced by, facts than the general population. But the general population mostly doesn't change their minds simply when they're actually shown that they're wrong about something. And we have also seen in the queer community, that simply knowing that someone who is queer is much more likely to change someone's mind. If they already respect someone, care about them, and then, oh, that person's gay or whatever, they may over time start to change their mind because of their past history with this person that they admire, or because this is a person in their family. So when people change their minds about something that's really closely related to their identity, it's usually more through that sort of a thing, not through arguing. And arguing too, I think, can just sometimes be off-putting to people. And there are a lot of religious people that I think we need to be working with in coalitions around shared values, which sometimes means, simply bracketing the fact that we don't necessarily share all the same beliefs.
Right. Yeah. This reminds me of something Lisa said a couple meetings back about, Lisa, remember when you said that a lot of people think that atheists believe nothing, and you countered that by saying we believe in humanistic values and such. And I think that's, try to incorporate that into, I try to, without being obnoxious, create opportunities or take opportunities that are there to talk to people about humanism and church and state separation. I don't actually debate with anyone. I don't think I've ever tried street epistemology, but the church and state separation thing is so important. And I have on occasion, just because of the conversation was going in that direction, actually on more than a few occasions, I've mentioned that I'm an atheist to people who I don't know well. And I think it's really important that, just similar, you talked about gay and trans people, it's really important that people know that they make assumptions about people they don't know, that they're exactly like them. And there are different people, sexually, religious, non-religious among them that they already know. And
I absolutely agree with that.
I never shy away from an opportunity to say I'm an atheist, and I don't try to convince anyone that it's really kind of saddens me a little bit to see. usually it goes okay. I think I get people thinking, I hope. There are a couple of awkward situations. Someone I see at the gym that I have been exercising at for years, and we chat about a lot of things. He's worked there for a long time, and I happened to mention one day that I was an atheist, and he really has kept his girlfriend, who also works there, they really avoid me. It's a very dramatic change. And another thing that affected me more personally, and I'm not going to stop mentioning it if it comes up in the conversation, but a woman that I thought I was going to I thought I had a new friend, and similar to my age, similar situation. We were having these great talks, and I never mentioned being an atheist, but there isn't much information about me on Facebook, but she could glean from, and this may be in my imagination, but she could glean from my meetup profile that I'm an atheist. And she just very suddenly changed and got very icy to me. And I don't know if that's the reason, but what else would it be? And she just pushed me out of her life. And there's no other way she could have known I was an atheist. I may be imagining that, but you do pay a price sometimes.
Sure, absolutely. Atheism is undoubtedly stigmatized across much of the United States, and that is a problem. So I think it is important for people to know that they know atheists. Completely agree with that.
Karaya, am I saying your name correctly? I hope so.
It's Karaya, but that's okay. I just appreciate people trying. I guess one thing question I have is, what are we doing to partner people in the movement that are trying to spread education, to partner with the media? Because a big part of I know when it comes to marriage equality, if for people who grow up in these conservative Christian circles where they are in these bubbles, they cut off all contact, so they're not real people in their mind, just out of lack of exposure. And media can be a really powerful way to be because I would talk to conservative Christians that were oh yeah, Mitch and Cam on Modern Family, and they're just they just want to be good dads, to Lily. It's even though it's there's literal gay people around, if they just go outside their bubble, it's they were able to connect with their own humanity in these characters, and therefore the humanity in others. And you can see with Pure Flix and with God's Not Dead, they're working really hard to push their messages. So I just didn't know something, because I think they're powerful.
It's a great question, and it's something that I think about a lot. And I know that there are a lot of good memoirs out there already, some others forthcoming, about people's experiences being harmed by this kind of Christianity and leaving it. And I think those narratives can be powerful, but I think they're all sort of individual sort of flashes in the pan, and we need to have them kind of break through as a phenomenon somehow. The exvangelical movement certainly has been a phenomenon online, and it's been mentioned in Vice and the New York Times and the Washington Post. It gets sometimes gets press, but I haven't ever seen it on cable news, as I said, except for Fox. Just when Exposed Christian Schools came up, it was mentioned on Fox and Friends twice, and they basically distorted what it was. They said this is a bunch of liberals trying to discredit Christian schools, and not that it was the stories of people who actually went to Christian schools and have stories to tell. And nobody corrected that, because the rest of the media doesn't want to touch anything that would seem too critical of Christianity. So, I'm hoping with the new book project that I'm working on that maybe it'll reach the wider public. I think it's a good thing we're talking about Christian nationalism, because that's at least starting to get people thinking, but I think it might be a little bit too much on a surface level right now. And I do wonder if there's ways we can kind of use that to expand the conversation. But yeah, I also, I make sure to cultivate a network with journalists. I do my own writing, but I don't know how to do anything to scale. You need a foundation and funding for that sort of thing.
Okay, Mike? You're up, Mike.
There we go. All right, thank you. Thank you, Chrissy. That was very insightful. I really appreciate your input here today on this issue. And what I wanted to ask you about was what your thoughts are about the sort of the long-term prognosis for this disease of Christian nationalism, given the fact that secularism has been on the rise according to polls. Also, if you look at other highly developed countries like Western Europe, where I travel a lot, and I know you have a real good understanding of European culture and everything, and you see how solidly secularism is now entrenched in many of those societies. Where do you think we'll end up, say, 20 years down the road, or 30 or 40 years down the road?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I could say that I'm unequivocally optimistic. Certainly, I am, cheered by the data on the rapid increase in the nuns, NONES, in the population. The religiously unaffiliated. I've definitely looked at that as good news. America does seem to be secularizing much later than European countries. And I think that's because we're an outlier in a lot of ways. Economically, wealth is so unevenly distributed here that it exacerbates cultural divides. We do have the whole sort of Confederate versus, the whole kind of shadow of the Civil War still hangs over us as well. But yeah, it tends to be where you have a lot of poverty and suffering. Christianity does tend to be popular, and it's just got a lot of entrenched institutional power. I mean, if you look at things like rehab programs, 12-step programs, things that are forced on sometimes prisoners or people who have to are ordered by a court to get counseling or to go to a drug rehab program. These things are often Christian, and nobody does anything about it. And we don't necessarily have the secular institutional alternatives available in most places, even though they should be. And most people aren't going to challenge that. Or who is, directly working with like the homeless in many cases, the Salvation Army, which is only going to feed and shelter you if you follow their rules, if you're not gay. It's tricky because the power and money is so entrenched, but clearly, America is secularizing. On the other hand, America is geographically polarizing more than ever. So, and that just kind of creates a powder keg because we have, the unfair advantages baked into our political system for white conservative Christians that come from equal representation in the Senate by state and the Electoral College. And we've seen how many presidents recently, Republican presidents, have been elected while losing the popular vote. So I really do fear that it's possible for, the white Christian minority to impose authoritarian rule on us for possibly generations if we don't find some way to get ourselves together and vote them out. But there are a lot of built-in disadvantages, and then there are also, of course, they've been working on new voter suppression laws. The Supreme Court is a joke. It's illegitimate in my view. Yeah. It's been stacked, and if we don't do anything about this, I feel like we're going to be stuck with a lot of their theocratic rules for our existence for a long time to come. But at some point, something has to give because most Americans don't want this. So how does that work out? How does that shake out? I don't know. I mean, maybe your question was just sort of, is America going to be a more secular place? Well, yes and no, yes. Because everyone goes to the, when you're secular, if you can get away from those conservative Christian communities, you do. Like, look at me. Hi, Mom. I moved to Portland, Oregon, from Indiana because I can't stand to live in Indiana anymore.
Sure.
So the middle of the country.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. And I agree with you 100% on the economic imbalance and how that is favoring all this. I just hoping for, I know secularization I think is coming, but can we do it without an authoritarian apocalypse like Germany had? Can we do it without a Hitler, coming to power and our whole world exploding and then have to rebuild from the rubble? you know.
Yeah, I mean, we may at least end up with some kind of American apartheid of a sort for a good while. And I mean, I don't know. Revolution, civil war, they're not impossible. The right's threatening them. I don't know how they would start, but I do think there's a lot of political violence in our future. And I would much rather that we can find some sort of soft landing scenario. But it's hard to see how you get there without some pretty serious political reforms that the right won't let us pass.
Yeah, won't let us pass. Right. Good.
I wanted to ask a little bit about where Portland plays in your personal journey. I moved to New Jersey from Portland. I lived in Portland for 20 formative years. I went through puberty there, so I like to say that I'm from there. And moving to, at first, a much more conservative part of New Jersey, that's part of the reason why I joined the NJHN, because I suddenly felt the need for people who shared my values in a way that I had never felt in Portland when it was just everywhere. And so I'm curious about your journey to Portland and how that has affected, who you are. And then the second question that just came up is, you were talking about how social media is less your focus now and more the writing is now. And I'm curious about that evolution as well, why you're going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, on the second question, I'm still pretty active on Twitter. But Twitter algorithms have changed since 2016, and they've started to limit my reach, even as my follow count has continued to go up to where I'm like over 70,000 now, but my tweets reach fewer people. And so that was just kind of disillusioning when that started happening. And there were also some kind of nasty splits in the exvangelical Twitter community. So I kind of withdrew from that to some degree and started focusing on other things. And that was after 2019, when I created that hashtag Expose Christian Schools. And I think it may have been the biggest exvangelical hashtag to date, at least for number of tweets in a short period of time. It was 3 or 4 days, there were 200,000 tweets with that hashtag. But yeah, after that, there were some nasty arguments and splits that I won't go into the details of among exvangelicals on Twitter. Some people really, really didn't like me. And I think being trans had something to do with it, though they would never admit that. But since then, yeah, I've also gotten more regular steady writing work, and I've gotten more serious about working on a book, so it takes more of my time. There's a part of me that kind of wants to get onto TikTok, but boy, it seems like a big learning curve, and I just haven't, gathered the energy to overcome that yet. But I do watch TikToks sometimes, and there's a lot of great exvangelical content on there. And where I do get a lot of hope from these days is definitely from the youth, But in terms of my own personal journey to Portland, well, it's been a very circuitous route. I wanted to become a college professor, and I got a PhD in modern Russian history from Stanford after attending Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana for my undergrad, then teaching English and Russia for a year. I was then able to get into Stanford and study Russian history. My interest in Russian stuff actually came from doing short-term youth mission trips in Russia, which today I'm super embarrassed about. But yeah, actually, I finally, 20 years later, I spilled the beans on all that in my essay in Empty the Pews. So if you go to book club and you get a copy of Empty the Pews, you'll hear more about my experience with missionaries and how, let's call it, missionary shenanigans, missionaries being unimpressive, eventually contributed to my loss of faith. But it was just one factor among many. And then, I also had this intense crisis of faith going on in my life from about the age of 16, where I had a lot of doubts, but I was also trying very hard to stay in it. And it was this huge existential, protracted, painful thing, went on through college. I understood by the time I was 21 that I couldn't be an evangelical Christian anymore, but I still tried really hard to hold on to some kind of Christian identity. And I tried not to talk about it too much because I didn't want to rock the boat with my parents. And when you're in these kind of evangelical communities, the expectation is that it's absolute political and religious conformity. If everyone doesn't believe the same things and vote the same way, it is threatening to the community. So it's really hard to break with that, because you know that there can and will be both social and psychological consequences. You don't know exactly if you'll lose all these relationships, but you know they'll become a lot more complicated at the very least, and you'll lose some social support. But I eventually realized that these questions of identity and identity loss that were going on with me there, and this very intellectual process of trying to figure out if I could still be some sort of Christian, but underneath it, some other things were going on and had been ever since my early childhood. In fact, I think the reason that I became a very cerebral kid and then excelled academically was because, well, everyone else was just going through our conservative Christian life, seemed to just be sort of swimming in it like a fish or whatever. I always felt off somehow and different, and like I didn't fit into the roles prescribed for me. So that caused me to sort of take a step back and live in my head. I do think some gender and sexuality repression was also part of that. So it's from very early age, I lived in my head, and I became like a little anthropologist. When I was like 9 years old, I was keeping a notebook where I wrote down things that my grandparents and my aunt pronounced differently, or where they used the grammar differently than my parents. And I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Why do they do that? Like the past tense of give is gave, the past tense of come is came, right? But my grandparents, well, they would just use come and give as the past tense and the present tense. Whoa, mind blown. So I'm keeping a notebook of just like ethnography, a 9-year-old's ethnography of central Indiana, Anyway, I didn't figure out I was queer until I was 33. I was actually living in Moscow, Russia, and teaching in a Russian university at the time. And this was just before Putin annexed Crimea, and he was already cracking down on the LGBTQ community. And then I didn't, come out publicly about that until 2019. And the online spats, and actually there was some bullying that I mentioned earlier, ended up kind of, long story short, forcing me to come out earlier than I felt ready for. And at that point, I had just, I'm telling this all out of order, but I had just spent 3 years teaching at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And then I ran out of steam on the academic job market. So basically I finished Stanford in 2012. I taught at a Russian university in Moscow for 3 years. Then I got a postdoc in Florida. I taught there for 3 years. And then I just kind of gave up on academia. So I moved back in, and all this time I'm like, when I finally get that solid job, I'm going to come out and I'm going to transition. And I just kept not getting the solid job. So I moved back in with my parents to try and reinvent myself, either as someone working in human rights advocacy or foreign policy, although more like a think tank. I certainly wouldn't have worked for the Trump administration. And I don't think I wanted a government job, but maybe, or if I could make it as a writer, because I'd started doing more writing for popular audiences. And anyway, I was always sort of interested in the Pacific Northwest, but I never had a chance to go there until 2017. And I just kind of fell in love with the area. And, I had spent all this time in California. I was in grad school for 8 years, but I never went that far up the coast. And I was trying to think about where to live, where it would be safe to go through gender transition. And I thought, well, Portland would be safe. And Oregon has good laws. So that factored into it. I also kind of thought, and it'll probably be another 20 or 30 years before they have a terrible fire problem like California. Wrong, we already have the fire problem. But, so that's sort of how I got to Portland. I like the vibe, although it is, even though people tell you this before you move there, you don't necessarily expect it, but it is sort of shockingly not diverse compared to other American urban centers of a similar size, though it is diversifying. So yeah, I like it here. It's a quirky place, and I'm a quirky person. So it's just kind of this thing in my head, this idea of Portland, and I moved here.
So, Chrissy, first of all, I want to tell you that I'm also from Indiana and grew up in Indiana, so we have that in common. I'm from southeastern Indiana, and I wanted to. You were talking about the conflict between evangelical groups, and you just mentioned this, but I was assuming that some of that has to do with some people left the evangelical aspect of Christianity, but still maintained their basic Christian beliefs. And then other people, you know, walked away from it entirely. So I do see that when I follow exvangelical folks on Twitter, that there's sort of that thing going on.
There were some tensions across those, you know, exvangelical atheist versus exvangelical believer or spiritual minds, but the group that kind of really nastily bullied me, it didn't so much have to do with that. I think it had to do with simply, they still thought in this very rigid way, in this very sort of rigid purity politics, you know, and
Right.
They actually put out a statement. It was called the Magdalene Collective, and it basically equated being a trans woman with being a cisgender male, or at least in terms of your childhood socialization. And it didn't mention me, but it clearly was targeting me. And it was this whole ugly thing that was trans misogynistic. But basically they were saying, you know, anyone, this is crude, but anyone born with a penis should not have a microphone in this movement, or should not be, you know, centered in this movement. They were really just envious that, you know, despite me having the credentials and everything and being older than them, that I was getting a lot more attention on Twitter than they were. And for me, it never was a power struggle like that. It never was about that. I really want to uplift multiple stories, because one person's story can't change things at social scale, you know?
And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is something I've seen you write about before, and that is that it's very rare in the media today that they reach out to non-religious you know, representatives to comment when a story comes up. In the past, the people they have reached out to have been, you know, far more radical atheists, or, you know, whatever you want to call it. I think from my perspective, I very rarely see a secular humanist perspective. I mean, there's Jamie Raskin, there's
yeah, I appreciate him for sure.
Yeah, and Jared Huffman in the political world, but just some of our own, like, you know, I'm often frustrated that folks from the American Humanist Association, or even Americans United.
Yeah, it's a double standard. You know, it's a real double standard in the media. And when media, you know, talk about people doing humanitarian work, it's always, they emphasize the churches, you know, but they never emphasize humanist groups also doing humanitarian work, aid work, and that sort of thing. So it's difficult, yeah, to break through. And it's Christian privilege in action, and we need to start talking about it. And maybe if we do enough, it'll eventually change.
So I'm going to be putting some links to Chrissy's work and to people who have been writing about Chrissy in the chat, if you want to pick those up before you go. Jan, I'm gonna, if you're quick, because we're now.
Yes, yeah, I think I can be very quick. Chrissy, I'm wondering, do you think there's any particular nefarious reason why Twitter's algorithm changed and you got less traction, or is it just a random thing that wasn't helpful?
You know, people who understand tech better than me could tell you more about it, but it certainly didn't affect only me. It affected a lot of people. They used to kind of up certain kinds of accounts and discussions in people's feeds if they knew they liked that sort of thing. They made some adjustments to that. And then I've heard from many people that they see my tweets a lot less. And then I've also talked to many other people who are having that same experience. Some things they also changed, like they essentially via algorithm sort of downvote tweets that include a link. So if you're a writer and one of your most important things to do is to get your work out there, well, if you have a link in your tweet, now Twitter is essentially punishing you for that because they want to keep people on the website. So people try to get around that by putting the link in a reply to the next tweet, or by having a link in a tweet and then quote tweeting their own tweets. Didn't mean to bang on the table, but yeah, they I don't know. I'm just not getting the same reach, and you know, it sounds like a conspiracy, but there's not much other explanation for it, given that my number of followers has just continued to like slowly and steadily rise. And then again, yeah, Twitter did announce that they made some algorithmic changes, and a lot of other people have said they're affected. And some of those people probably understand the tech stuff better than I do.
I was just wondering if certain views were being singled out.
I think there is some of that. We have definitely seen from Facebook and Twitter some sensitivity toward people who are socially critical of white people or Christians. So, you know, they've definitely, Facebook has started, you know, flagging a lot of accounts and temporarily restricting them if they talk about things like racism or white privilege. It's very weird. And I think that some of that's happening on Twitter too.
Thanks.
Okay. So I've been putting some links in here, and I think folks can stay for a little bit if they want to just chat. Some of us have a meeting at 6 o'clock that we'll have to get to shortly. I will have to shut it off within about 10 minutes so I can.
Lisa, I have a request. Those look like some really great links. Could you put that on our meetup page? Because that's all going to go away when you close this Zoom.
Yeah, you can also, yes, you can save the chat.
Right, you can do that.
3 dots and save the chat.
Okay.
I will also get an automatic document with this, but I will, yes, I will put all these in the discussion on the meetup, because that's the place where, you know, it's difficult to get them.
And also people who weren't with us today can see it that way as well.
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and as I said, I mean, since a lot of people couldn't come, I mean, yeah, if they want to watch the recording, that's totally fine with me. Any non-commercial distribution, go for it.
Okay.
And yeah, I just want to say thank you again, Lisa, for reaching out to me and inviting me. It's been lovely chatting with you all this afternoon, and I love to, you know, do this sort of thing and just get to meet people and talk with people and share my story with a sympathetic audience. So thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chrissy.
I guess I will check out then.
Yes, we'll be in touch.
Have a great day, everybody. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.